The world had not fallen apart in a single day. It happened slowly, piece by piece, over many months, until the sky grew darker than anyone remembered, and people began to wonder if sunlight would ever return. In the beginning, most people believed everything would get better. They waited for news, for rescue teams, for leaders to speak with confidence. But nothing came. The world kept getting quieter, as if it was holding its breath, waiting for something that would never happen. Inside one of the many underground shelters, people lived crowded together in small rooms that once felt temporary. After so long, the place no longer looked like a shelter. It felt like a forgotten corner of the world. The air smelled of metal, dust, and old memories. Children had learned to grow up without seeing the open sky, and adults spent their days doing simple tasks to keep the shelter running. Among them lived a quiet woman named Dr. Mara Ellis. Before everything changed, she had studied stars, galaxies, and patterns in the universe. She once spent nights looking through telescopes, amazed by how bright and alive the sky felt. Now she lived in a room barely big enough to hold a small bed and a desk. Her notebooks were filled not with discoveries, but with old reminders of who she used to be. Most days, Mara helped maintain the shelter's communication room. It was a small space filled with blinking lights, wires taped together, and screens that rarely showed anything useful. Her job was to check if any outside signals reached them, anything that might prove someone else was still out there. But for months, she had heard nothing except silence. People in the shelter had stopped asking her for updates. They no longer expected good news. They no longer expected anything at all. Many had accepted that the world outside was gone for good, and that they were simply waiting for time to run out. Even Mara had started to feel that heavy numbness that came from losing hope. She didn't show it openly, but inside she felt the same slow fading that everyone else did. Some nights, she stared at the dim ceiling, trying to remember the color of real sunlight. She wondered if she had ever truly appreciated how warm it felt on her skin. Life in the shelter had become routine. People woke up, ate small meals, performed their tasks, tried to stay busy, and went to sleep. Conversations were short and soft. Laughter was rare, and when it happened, it sounded strange, almost out of place. One evening, as Mara walked through the narrow hallways toward the communication room, she noticed how tired everyone looked. Shoulders were hunched, eyes half open, steps slow. A few people sat quietly in the common area, staring at the wall as if trying to remember something important they had forgotten long ago. The sight made her heart feel heavy, but she kept walking. If she stopped to think too deeply, she knew she would crumble. When she entered the communication room, she found the equipment as lifeless as ever. She took a seat, adjusted her headphones, and stared at the monitor that often showed only static. She pressed a few buttons, even though she knew the signals rarely changed. Still, she kept trying. It was one of the last habits she refused to let go of, even if a small part of her felt foolish for hoping got hours past. The room hummed softly with the sound of machines, and Mara almost fell asleep at her desk. Then something unusual happened, something so small and unexpected that she thought she imagined it. A tiny sound. A faint beep. She sat up quickly, alert. For the first time in days, her eyes focused on the screen, watching closely. The beep came again, not loud, not clear, but real. Her heart started beating faster, and she leaned closer, adjusting the controls with careful hands. At first, the sound was messy, like random noise, but there was something different about it, something structured. She listened again and again, each time feeling a little spark of curiosity grow inside her. It wasn't enough to call it hope, not yet, but it was enough to make her breathe a little deeper. She replayed the signals several times, trying to understand it. The pattern wasn't familiar, and it didn't match the old emergency codes the shelter used. It was as if someone was trying to say something, but didn't have the strength to speak clearly. Mara rubbed her eyes, wondering if she was just exhausted. Maybe it was interference from the damaged antenna above ground. Maybe it was nothing at all. But she had listened to static for months. She knew what nothing sounded like. This was not nothing. She stepped out into the hallway and found two of the shelter's engineers, telling them she had detected something strange. They followed her to the communication room, though their expressions showed little excitement. After all this time, they found it hard to believe in anything new. The engineers listened, checked the equipment, and shrugged. They told her it was likely just interference from the broken wiring or the old antennas. They advised her not to waste energy on it. After they left, the room felt colder, but Mara stayed seated. She couldn't let it go. Something inside her told her the signal meant something. She wasn't sure how she knew it was just a feeling, a quiet voice telling her not to give up so easily. She spent the next several hours studying the sound. The shelter had limited power, so she worked quickly but carefully. She slowed the signal down, sped it up, filtered out the noise, and compared it to old data logs. Bit by bit, she started to notice a repeating pattern, faint, imperfect, but definitely there. With every small discovery, her heart grew lighter. She felt awake again, almost like the person she used to be. For the first time in a long while, her brain sparked with curiosity rather than fear. But even as she studied the signal, she kept her expectations low. She didn't want to assume it was a message from another shelter or a lost research station. She didn't want to give herself false hope. The world had disappointed everyone too many times already. Still, she kept working. As the hours passed, she began to realize something extraordinary. The signal didn't match any known frequencies used by other shelters. It also didn't match the old government channels or any emergency broadcasts she had on file. It was coming from somewhere different, somewhere unexpected. She checked the direction. The signal originated far from their location, beyond the mountain ranges, in a place most people believed had been destroyed long ago. A place that no one had dared to search because the journey was nearly impossible. Her breath caught when she read the coordinates again. It wasn't an error. The signal came from the research outpost that people once whispered about, the one rumored to have stored advanced equipment before losing contact years earlier. Many believed everyone there had perished. Yet here was a signal, faint, weak, but real. For a long moment, Mara sat completely still, letting the truth sink in. If the outpost still had power, even just a little, then someone could still be alive. Someone could be trying to reach them. And if the rumors were true about what the outpost had been working on, then this signal wasn't just proof of survivors. It could be something far bigger, not something the world desperately needed. She leaned back in her chair, feeling a strange warmth rising in her chest. It wasn't joy exactly, but it was close. It was something she hadn't felt in months. A spark, a possibility, direction. She didn't know how the others would react. She didn't know if they'd believe her. But she knew one thing for certain. After so many months of silence, the world had spoken again, and she was going to answer. The faint signal stayed in Mara's mind long after she left the communication room that night. Even when she tried to sleep, her thoughts kept returning to that soft beep, the strange rhythm, and the quiet message hidden inside it. She kept replaying it in her head, wondering if she had misunderstood it or imagined it. But she knew she hadn't. It was real, and she felt its importance deep inside. The next morning, she returned to the communication room early, long before most people woke up. The hallways were almost silent, lit only by the dim emergency bulbs that flickered every few seconds. She moved quietly, almost afraid that if she made too much noise, The signal might disappear. She sat down at her desk, adjusted the controls. Again, and listened. At first, there was only static, the same soft hiss she had become used to. But then, there it was again. The same weak sound. The same uneven pattern. It repeated at irregular intervals, as if whatever or whoever was sending it had limited power. She took a deep breath. This was no accident, Dot. She began studying it again, going through every small detail. She moved the sliders, filtered out extra noise, and watched as faint lines appeared on the screen, showing the signal's rhythm. It wasn't perfect, but it wasn't random either. There was intention behind it. Later in the morning, a young technician named Rian entered the room. He often helped with repairs and maintenance, and though he rarely spoke much, he was kind-hearted and patient. He saw Mara studying the signal again and walked over quietly. "Still checking it?" he asked softly. "Yes," she replied. "It's not just interference." Rian listened with one ear, squinting slightly. "It does sound different. But it's so weak. Maybe it's nothing." Mara didn't argue. She simply said, "I want to keep trying." He nodded and left her alone. Nobody wanted to crush anyone's hope, even if they didn't believe in it themselves. Hours passed. People came and went from the communication room, most barely giving her more than a polite nod. Everyone was busy with their own tasks. Air filters needed constant cleaning. Water lines needed repairs. Food supplies needed careful monitoring. Life in the shelter was exhausting, and people rarely had the energy to think about anything beyond survival. But Mara's mind was no longer stuck inside those metal walls. Her thoughts had begun to reach farther, stretching toward the coordinates she discovered the night before. She imagined what the old research outpost might look like now. Had time destroyed it completely? Or were people still inside, waiting? Just like her? By midday, the shelter director, a calm man named Rowan, visited the communication room. He always tried to appear composed, even when the situation was bad. People trusted him because he never raised his voice and never pretended things were better than they were. He watched Mara work quietly for a moment before speaking. "I've heard you detected something yesterday." She nodded and replayed the signal for him. He listened carefully, brow slightly furrowed. "It's weak," he said honestly. Double quotes, yes, but it's consistent. Could it be leftover signals from old satellites? He asked. I checked. It doesn't match. Rowan looked at the monitor again, thoughtful but cautious. Even if it's a real message, the outpost is too far. We don't have the supplies to reach it. I just want to understand it, she replied gently. That's all for now. Rowan sighed quietly. You're free to continue. Just don't get others excited too quickly. People are fragile these days. Mara understood. She wasn't trying to give anyone false hope. She wasn't even giving it to herself. She simply wanted answers. For the next few hours, she worked nonstop. She wrote down numbers, patterns, and timing intervals. The more she decoded, the more she realized something extraordinary. This wasn't a distress signal. It wasn't calling for emergency help. Instead, it seemed to be sending coordinates over and over again, like a beacon. Something or someone wanted people to find them. She leaned back in her chair, heart beating faster. A beacon meant purpose. A beacon meant survival was still happening somewhere out there. As the day went on, a small buzz of curiosity spread quietly through the shelter. People whispered to each other in hallways. Did you hear? There might be a signal. Maybe. It's nothing. Maybe it's something. Do you think anyone is alive out there? Nobody said these things loudly. Speaking hope too openly felt dangerous, like touching something fragile that could break instantly. But people still whispered, because even a tiny spark was better than nothing. By evening, Mara had decoded enough to feel confident. The signal pointed toward the distant outpost believed to be destroyed. She double-checked everything, even when her eyes felt heavy and her neck hurt from leaning forward all day. She wasn't imagining it. The data was clear. She decided to show her findings to a small group, just the people who handled resource planning, travel risk assessments, and equipment repairs. She didn't want to create a wave of false excitement. She just needed experts to confirm whether the journey could even be considered. The group gathered in a small meeting area, the kind of space once meant for planning celebrations or community events. Now it felt more like a place where difficult decisions were made. They sat around a metal table, looking tired but curious. Mara explained everything she had discovered. She showed them the signal. She showed them the decoded pattern. She showed them the coordinates. At first, nobody spoke. They simply stared at the information in front of them. One of the repair workers, an older man with deep wrinkles and gentle eyes, finally said, "If this is real, it could mean survivors. But the journey is nearly impossible," someone else added. "The surface storms alone could wipe out a team. We would need proper suits, new filters, extra oxygen," another person pointed out. "We barely have enough fuel for heating. How would we power a long-distance travel machine?" Someone else asked. The room filled with concerns. None of them were wrong. The world outside was harsh, unpredictable, and dangerous. Every risk carried heavy weight. Through it all, Mara stayed quiet, listening carefully. She didn't push anyone. She didn't try to convince them. She simply offered the truth. There might be survivors, she finally said quietly. If they have anything useful, equipment, technology, or even knowledge, it could change everything. It could help all of us. Her voice wasn't loud. It wasn't emotional. It was steady, calm, honest. Rowan spoke last. "Let's not shut this down. Not yet. Let's study it more. If the signal continues for a few more days, we'll talk about a scouting team." A wave of relief washed through Mara. It wasn't approval, but it wasn't rejection. It was a possibility. The meeting ended, and people returned to their duties. But something felt different. The air in the shelter felt lighter, almost like a breeze had passed through a space that had been still for too long. That night, as people prepared for sleep, quiet conversations continued. Nobody wanted to get too excited, but small smiles appeared here, and they're real smiles, not forced ones. Mara returned to the communication room one more time before resting. She played the signal again softly. It sounded the same as before, weak, distant, uneven. But to her, it felt like someone whispering through the darkness, saying, "We are still here." For the first time in months, she didn't feel completely alone. Before she left the room, she touched the edge of the screen gently, as if thanking it for bringing a small piece of light back into their dim world. The next morning would bring more work, more decoding, and more uncertain discussions. But tonight, she let herself feel something she had almost forgotten how to feel. Maybe, just maybe, hope had not died after all. The days that followed were filled with a strange mix of anxiety and quiet excitement. The signal kept returning every few hours, weak but steady, as if someone far away refused to give up. Each time Mara heard it, she felt a soft pull inside her, a reminder that the world outside was not completely silent. Other people in the shelter soon learned about the signal too, not through announcements, but through small conversations whispered over meals or during work shifts. A few people tried not to get their hopes up, but even they couldn't hide the small spark in their eyes. It had been so long since anyone heard anything from outside that even the tiniest possibility felt like fresh air. As promised, Rowan and the team in charge of shelter operations monitored the signal for several more days. When it continued to appear in the same pattern, they finally agreed it was not a mistake. It wasn't interference or leftover noise from old satellites. It was a real beacon, coming from the same coordinates every time. And the coordinates matched the old research outpost. That was when the real discussions began. Every evening, a small group would gather in the planning room. Rowan, a few engineers, survival specialists, the mapkeeper, and of course Mara. They sat around a table, old papers and faded maps spread out in front of them. A battery-powered lamp lit the room with a soft, warm glow. The first question they had to answer was simple but heavy, that how could they reach the outpost? The world above ground had become unpredictable. The storms were not like old weather patterns. They carried dust, static charges, and sudden temperature drops. Traveling long distances without preparation was dangerous, but staying in the shelter forever was also dangerous. Supplies were running low. Repair materials were nearly gone. The air filters were old and fragile. Reaching the outpost might not only bring answers, but possibly solutions. We need a small team, Rowan said during one meeting. Not many people, just enough to travel, explore, and bring back information. The engineers agreed. A small group meant less weight to carry, fewer supplies needed, and faster movement. Rian, a young technician who often worked with Mara, suggested using the old surface transport, a rugged vehicle that hadn't been used in years. It was built for rough terrain, with thick wheels and a heavy frame. The problem was that it needed repairs. We can fix it, Rian said. Not perfectly, but enough to make the journey. Everyone looked at him, half surprised by his confidence. He smiled shyly. I've been checking it secretly for months, he admitted, just in case we ever needed it again. Mara felt a warm appreciation for him. Even people who looked quiet or hopeless still carried silent hope inside them. They all cared more than they showed. The next several days were filled with preparation. The shelter buzzed with a kind of slow energy, like a heart that was learning to beat again. Engineers cleaned old engines, repaired broken wiring, tested oxygen tanks, and checked protective suits. People who weren't part of the mission helped in small ways, sewing torn straps, sharpening tools, organizing food packets, or simply offering encouraging words. Mara helped where she could, but her main focus stayed on the signal. She listened to it every day, studying its rhythm as if learning a new language. She wanted to understand as much as possible before the journey began. Sometimes she closed her eyes while listening, imagining the people on the other side. She wondered what they looked like, how many they were, and how they had survived for so long. At night, she often sat alone in her small room, thinking about the journey. She wasn't afraid of the outside world. She had already accepted that. Danger existed everywhere. What she feared was failure. What if the journey led to nothing? What if the signal was an automated beacon, with no one alive to answer? How would she face the shelter if she returned with empty news? But every time doubt crept into her mind, she reminded herself of one thing. Doing nothing would not save anyone. Taking the risk was their only chance to change anything. One evening, after several long days of preparation, Rowan walked into the communication room, where Mara was reviewing the latest signal. He leaned against the doorway with a thoughtful expression. We've chosen the team, he said softly. Mara turned to face him, waiting. You will be part of it. Her heart skipped a beat. She knew it was possible, but hearing it felt different. She felt a strange mix of honor, fear, and determination. Who else? She asked. Rowan named a few others. Rian, a strong and level-headed mechanic named Terran, a skilled navigator named Lyra, and a calm medic known simply as Den. It was a balanced team, each person chosen for a reason. They all had skills needed for survival, repair, and exploration. They all agreed to go Rowan added. No pressure. No one was forced. Mara nodded slowly. People were tired of being trapped. Even the idea of stepping outside, no matter how dangerous, felt like freedom. Over the next 2 days, the team trained together. They tested their protective suits, practiced setting up temporary shelters, learned how to move through rough terrain, and reviewed emergency protocols. They spent long hours studying maps, the mountains, dried river paths, collapsed cities, and old roads now buried under dust. The journey to the outpost would take several days, maybe longer if storms slowed. They would need to ration food, rotate sleep schedules, and stay alert at all times. No one pretended it would be easy. The night before departure, the shelter held a quiet gathering. It wasn't a celebration. It was more like a silent show of support. People stood in small groups, offering warm smiles, gentle pats on the back, and simple words like "stay safe" or "come back soon." Nobody cried or made dramatic speeches. Life had taught them to feel deeply without making noise. Mara felt a kind of heaviness in her chest as she looked around. These people were her world now. They had suffered together, survived together, and held on to the little hope they had. She didn't want to disappoint them. Later, when most people had gone to rest, she walked to the communication room one last time. The equipment hummed softly. She put on her headphones and played the signal again. As she listened, she felt something new, not fear, not curiosity, but connection. She whispered quietly, even though she knew no one could hear her. "We're coming." The next morning, the entire shelter gathered quietly near the large metal doors that led to the surface. The air was filled with tension and anticipation. The doors hadn't been opened in years. Nobody knew what the world above would look like now. Rian and Taryn stood by the repaired vehicle, checking final adjustments. Lyra studied her maps, whispering to herself. Den arranged medical supplies in small compartments. Mara stood with her backpack, breathing slowly, calming her racing thoughts. Rowan approached the group with a steady look. "This journey is not just about reaching the outpost," he said softly. "It's about giving us direction again. Whatever you find, information, supplies, or even confirmation that others are alive, it will guide our future. Thank you for taking this risk." His words were simple, but they meant everything. Finally, the moment arrived. The heavy metal doors slowly lifted, making a deep echo through the shelter. A cold gust of outside air rushed in, carrying dust and then the faint smell of earth. People shielded their eyes as sunlight, weak but real, filtered through the opening. Mara stepped outside first. The ground was uneven, covered in dry soil and scattered debris. The sky was a pale gray, not fully clear, but not fully dark either. It felt like the world was caught between two moments, destruction and rebirth. The others followed, and the vehicle rolled forward, its engine rumbling softly. As the doors closed behind them, Mara felt both fear and freedom. The shelter was now behind them, and the unknown lay ahead. The journey had begun. Their mission was simple in words, but heavy in meaning. Reach the outpost, find the source of the signal, and uncover the truth. Every mile they traveled would bring them closer to answers, and farther from the world they knew. And though the road ahead was filled with uncertainty, one thing was clear. Hope was moving with them. The journey to the old research outpost turned out to be even harder than the team expected. The world outside was different now, quieter, colder, but also strangely beautiful in its own broken way. The sun barely showed itself behind the heavy layers of sky, and the air carried a dry smell that made them feel like they were walking through the remains of an old dream. For days, the vehicle crawled across uneven ground. Some parts were covered in cracked earth, others with abandoned roads split open by time. The team moved slowly and carefully, stopping often to check their surroundings and rest. Every night, they set up a temporary camp. They sat around small lanterns, sharing simple meals and quiet conversations. Sometimes they talked about what the world used to be like. Other times they sat in silence, letting the calm night settle around them. Each of them carried their own worries, their own hopes, their own memories. Mara kept the device that tracked the signal close to her at all times. She checked it every few hours, even when she tried to sleep. And every time she saw the faint blinking light showing the direction of the beacon, she felt her determination grow stronger. The closer they got to the outpost, the stronger the signal became. One afternoon, as the vehicle rolled over a ridge of dry land, the signal surged suddenly. It wasn't loud or clear, but it was definitely stronger. Mara felt her heart leap. "We're close," she said, her voice calm but full of excitement. The others leaned forward, looking through the dusty windshield. In the far distance, something stood against the horizon, a cluster of metallic shapes, half buried under layers of ash and sand. It didn't look like much from afar, but they knew what it was. The outpost. As they approached, the full structure came into view. The building was large but badly damaged. Parts of the walls had collapsed, and the tall communication tower had fallen sideways, laying across the ground like a broken branch. The exterior was covered in dust, giving it a faded, ghost-like appearance. Still, it was standing. That alone felt like a miracle. The vehicle stopped a few meters away. The team climbed out slowly, each step filled with tension. Mara felt her hands tremble slightly, not from fear, but from the overwhelming weight of the moment. She had listened to the signal for so long that finally seeing its source felt unreal. Rian scanned the area. "It looks quiet," he said softly. Lyra checked her map and nodded. "This is the exact location. If the signal is coming from here, someone or something is still active inside." They walked toward the entrance carefully. The main door was blocked by fallen debris, but a smaller side entrance was half open. It looked like someone had forced it from the inside at some point. Taron pushed it gently. It creaked, but it moved. Inside, the air was cold and still. Light filtered through small cracks in the ceiling, making the dust in the air shimmer gently. The hallway was lined with equipment that looked abandoned. Some screens were cracked. Others were covered with grime. The walls were scratched and worn. But then they saw something that made them stop. A faint light, deep inside the hallway, behind a partially open door. A small blue light flickered. It wasn't bright, but it was steady. It was a sign of life, of power, of someone maintaining something. Mara felt her chest tighten as she stepped toward it. When they pushed open the door fully, they entered a large control room. It was filled with machines, wires, and old devices that looked like they hadn't been touched in years. But in the center of the room sat a figure, a person, thin and tired-looking, staring at a monitor. He turned slowly when he heard their footsteps. His eyes widened slightly, as if he couldn't believe what he was seeing. For a moment, nobody spoke. The room was completely still. Finally, the man stood up, steadying himself with the edge of the desk. His voice came out rough but warm. "You heard the signal?" Mara nodded. "We followed it." A long silence followed, filled with emotion. That words couldn't explain. The man introduced himself as Jonas. He was one of the few remaining members of the research team that once worked in this outpost. Years ago, when communication with the world collapsed, he and a small group stayed behind, hoping to maintain the equipment that might one day help rebuild what had been lost. Over time, storms damaged the outpost. Supplies ran low. Many of the researchers left in search of safer ground. Some didn't make it back. Others disappeared into the chaos outside. Eventually, only a handful remained. And now, Jonas said with quiet sadness, only 2 of us are left. He gestured toward a small door at the back of the room. Inside, they found a woman resting on a cot. She looked weak but conscious. Her eyes softened when she saw the team. She whispered a greeting, her voice barely stronger than the air around her dot. Mara felt a lump rise in her throat. These people had survived against all odds. They had held on to the last pieces of hope when the world had given them nothing in return. After the initial introductions, Jonas led them deeper into the outpost. They walked through rooms filled with old scientific tools, storage containers, and machines covered in dust. But then he opened a door that revealed something completely different. A room full of working equipment, not broken, not abandoned, not functional, not the. Machines hummed softly. The screens glowed with faint but steady light. Mara felt a wave of shock wash over her. She turned to Jonas, eyes wide. You still have power? Jonas nodded. Limited, but enough for what we've been protecting. He walked toward a large device in the center of the room. It was connected to tubes, wires, and glowing panels. The device looked complex, but there was something gentle about its design, as if it was created to help and heal, not destroy. This, Jonas said softly, is a prototype. We call it the Atmos unit. Mara leaned forward. What does it do? It restores damaged air. It can clean toxic particles, rebuild lost oxygen layers, and stabilize small sections of the atmosphere. We tested earlier versions on controlled areas before everything fell apart. It worked. We just never got the chance to use it on a larger scale. The team stared at the machine in disbelief. If this device truly worked, it could change everything. Not instantly, not magically, but slowly, gradually, in a way that mattered. It could bring back cleaner skies, safer air, and a chance for the world to recover. It's the reason we kept the beacon running, Jonas continued. We hoped someone somewhere would hear it and come. The world may look broken, but with this, it doesn't have to stay that way. Mara felt tears prick her eyes. She didn't cry often, not since the world changed. But now, standing in this room surrounded by old machines and new hope, she felt something stir inside her, something she hadn't felt in a long time. Possibility that the team spent the next few hours learning everything they could. Jonas showed them how the machine worked, how to maintain it, and how to move it safely. It wasn't small, but it was transportable. With effort and teamwork, they could bring it back to the shelter. Later that evening, they all gathered in the main control room. A small heater glowed in the corner, offering warmth. Jonas handed out cups of warm water flavored with herbs they had grown in a tiny indoor garden. It wasn't fancy, but it felt comforting. As they sat together, the silence carried a completely different feeling than before. It wasn't heavy or hopeless. It was peaceful, shared, meaningful. The woman resting nearby smiled faintly. You came at the right time, she whispered. We were starting to wonder if anyone would ever find us. We were starting to wonder if anyone was left at all, Mara replied gently. Jonas lowered his gaze, his voice soft. We held on because if we let go, then everything we built, the research, the knowledge, the chance to fix things, it would all disappear. And now, Rian said, it won't. They all shared a quiet, powerful moment of understanding. The next day, they would begin preparing the device for transport. It would take time, effort, and coordination, but they were ready for it. For the first time since the world had changed, they weren't just surviving. They were moving toward something better. Hope didn't feel distant anymore. It was right there in the room with them. The moment the first faint rays of sunlight touched the broken ground, it didn't feel real to anyone. For so long, People had lived under a sky that never cleared, a sky that felt heavy and tired. Many had forgotten what real sunlight even looked like. They had grown used to the dull gray glow that never warmed anything. But now, as the clouds shifted and a soft beam of golden light slipped through, everyone stood still, trying to understand if it was really happening. The small team that had survived the long journey could barely believe what they were seeing. After everything they had crossed, the dusty plains, the ruined towns, the abandoned shelters, they were finally standing somewhere that felt alive again. For a long moment, nobody spoke. The silence was full of surprise and quiet joy, the kind that made a person feel something deep in their chest. The machine they had worked so hard to repair hummed softly in the background. It wasn't grand or beautiful. It was worn, scratched, and patched together with different parts. But this simple machine held the hope of restoring the world. It had taken days to prepare it, and even then, they weren't sure it would work. When they finally turned it on, they held their breath, waiting for any sign. And now, this gentle transformation in the air was the answer they needed. At the front of the group stood the scientist, who had first discovered the signal that led them here. She watched the sky with calm, steady eyes. She wasn't thinking about the danger they had faced or the fear that had almost stopped them so many times. She was only thinking about the people who were still waiting, people in the shelters who had not seen the sky in years. She imagined their faces when they learned what had happened. That thought alone made her feel lighter. Near her stood the leader of the hidden research team, the one who had kept the old station running against all odds. He had spent years trying to reach anyone through the broken communication lines. When he finally succeeded, he wasn't sure if his message would be understood or ignored. But the moment he saw the rescue team arrive, tired but determined, he realized his efforts had not been wasted. Together, the two of them watched the ground below. It wasn't green yet, not fully, but tiny signs were beginning to show, small patches where the soil looked softer, where the dust didn't cling so stubbornly. It was like the world was taking a slow, careful breath after being held underwater for too long. The others gathered around them. One of the younger members of the group, who had barely been a teenager when the disaster struck, pointed excitedly at a small plant pushing through the soil. It looked fragile, almost shy, but it was there. The group gathered around it like it was a miracle. For them, it truly was. A tiny piece of life, growing where everything had been silent and empty. Some of the older members wiped tears from their faces. They weren't embarrassed. They had lived through years of struggle rationing water, sharing scraps of food, comforting others who had lost hope. Seeing something alive again unlocked emotions they had kept buried for survival. The scientist knelt down and touched the edge of the soil gently, as if afraid of disturbing the new growth. She smiled without saying a word. Her smile carried relief, gratitude, and a quiet pride that couldn't be described easily. She had always believed that there was still something worth saving, even when almost everyone else doubted it. As the day went on, the sky continued to clear little by little. A soft breeze replaced the harsh winds they were used to. It carried a freshness that none of them expected. It didn't smell like the old world, not yet, but it smelled clean. It smelled like a beginning. Back inside the station, everyone gathered to send a message to the remaining shelters. The communication device wasn't perfect. It squeaked, cracked, and hummed before every transmission, but it worked well enough. They spent a long time discussing what to say. They didn't want to promise too much too quickly. They knew hope could be delicate. It had to be real, not exaggerated. Finally, they decided on simple words. They explained what they had seen. The clearing sky, the return of sunlight, the small signs of life. They told everyone that the machine was working and that more progress was possible. They encouraged people to stay strong and prepare, because soon they might be able to come to the surface safely. When the message was sent, there was a long moment of silence. Then the machine crackled again, and replies began to come in one after another, voices full of disbelief, joy, and relief. Some voices were trembling. Some were laughing. Some simply whispered, "Thank you." Listening to them, everyone in the station felt the weight of the journey lift from their shoulders. That night, nobody wanted to sleep. They stayed awake around small lights, sharing stories about the world before it changed. They spoke about simple things: fresh air, open fields, the sound of birds. Many of them had not seen such things since childhood, even though they could not bring back the old world exactly as it was. They felt certain now that they could build something meaningful. The next morning, the sunlight came again, a little stronger this time. More patches of the sky cleared. The team decided to explore the surrounding area to check how far the changes had spread. As they walked, they noticed a slight warmth in the air, something they had forgotten long ago. They saw dust settling. Instead of swirling endlessly, they saw cracks in old rocks where tiny roots were beginning to push through. Every step they took felt like a victory, even if the progress was small. The world was changing, slowly but surely. And for the first time in many years, the change was good. When they returned to the station, new plans were already forming. They talked about sending groups to restore water systems, to clean out old paths, to rebuild safe places where families could live again. None of these tasks would be easy, but now they seemed possible. And possibility was more precious than anything. As the days passed, more messages arrived from shelters asking when they could come. Some of the messages were emotional, filled with the voices of people who had been waiting for a sign. Others were cautious, wanting to make sure it was truly safe. The team answered each message patiently, letting everyone know that help was coming and that no one would be left alone. One late afternoon, when the sky showed shades of blue no one had seen in years, the scientist stood alone outside the station. For a moment, she looked at the horizon, where a faint line of green was appearing. It wasn't much, but it was real. She closed her eyes and took a slow, deep breath. For the first time in a long while, the air didn't feel heavy. It felt like a promise. Behind her, the others were preparing supplies for the first group of people who would come from the shelters. There was excitement mixed with nervousness. They knew they were responsible for guiding these people, helping them adapt to the new world forming around them. But they also knew they wouldn't be doing it alone. As the sun set, the sky painted itself with colors that had been missing for so long: soft oranges, gentle pinks, and hints of purple. Everyone gathered outside to watch it. No one said a word. Some smiled. Some cried quietly. Some simply stared, afraid to blink in case the colors disappeared. In that peaceful silence, they all understood the same thing. The world was not fully healed. There was still so much work to do. There would still be challenges, struggles, and days filled with uncertainty. But the darkness that once felt endless was finally breaking, and they had become the ones to lead others out of it. They didn't see themselves as heroes. They were just ordinary people who had refused to give up. And because of that, humanity had a chance again. Their journey had started with a single faint signal in a world that seemed forgotten. Now, it was ending with the first dawn of renewal. And soon, it would become the beginning of a new chapter for everyone.